What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to introduce Steve Blank, who's going to come out here. And we're going to talk about his work in designing startup communities and designing startup systems. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for being here. Okay. Let me get a, here we go. Thank you. I need my cheat sheet here. Well, thank you, Steve. It's really an honor to be here. Steve is a titan in the startup world. He really has developed a tremendous body of knowledge and thought and leadership around how we design startups better. What's the scientific process by which startup companies can be formed? And what's interesting in some of our conversations is that he's been thinking now about how do you move beyond that. And so this talk we've titled Moving Beyond Accelerators and Incubators, to think about how do we design whole systems or communities of entrepreneurial activity. And so I wanted to have a conversation and dialogue with Steve, but wanted to do something somewhat iconoclastic, which we're going to do throughout this whole conference, which is we're going to start with the audience first. And so before I ask Steve questions, we're going to spend a few minutes actually just hearing the things that you want to learn about from Steve, from the conference, and that we can answer here for you. And I'd ask each of you to keep it short, because we want to get a lot of people's opinions and thoughts in. So, on the order of 20 to 30 seconds per person. And just tell us what you want to learn here today, and what we can talk about here that would be useful and interesting to you. And we're going to do this, by the way, in all the panel sessions and throughout the conference. We're going to start with the audience first. Maybe we should start by thinking about the I-Core program and what you've done there. And one of the questions was, how do you maintain a culture of innovation across so many different companies? Maybe you could share a little bit about the program and how you've tried to design it in ways like that?
Sure, but it might be helpful to actually start with how many of you actually know what a lean startup is? Half?
Half?
Yeah, so let me spend 30 seconds maybe giving a preamble. Lean startup is just a new way to think about early stage ventures. We used to think of startups as smaller versions of large companies. And what we now know is that's been a 75-year-old mistake here in Silicon Valley. Large companies execute known business models. New ventures search for them. And this distinction between search and execution is what had us teaching how to write business plans to entrepreneurs, when in fact we know no business plan survives first contact with customers. In fact, the only thing useful about writing a business plan in college is that if it's part of the English department, it's the best example of creative writing that you're going to have your students do. Because what we know is Appendix A, anybody ever see Appendix A? Income statement, balance sheet, cash flow, 5-year plan? Well, the only people, remember in an existing corporation, a 5-year plan is a set of knowns with maybe 1 or 2 unknowns. In a startup, a 5-year plan is a series of unknowns. And the only people ever to require a 5-year plan on a series of unknowns were venture capitalists in the Soviet Union. And we know how well that turned out. So what we decided that there might be a more efficient way to help startups actually think about the search for a business model. And so we decided that there were 3 components. One is that we needed to frame what it was they were actually doing in the first year. And the mistake was they all thought they were supposed to be building a product and then shipping it. And that's why most startups fail. Most startups don't fail because they didn't ship a product. Most startups fail because they didn't find sufficient customers and markets. They failed to find product market fit. And implicitly is they had a set of untested hypotheses. And I use the word hypotheses at Stanford because my students pay 50 grand a year, but everywhere else we call them guesses. So if you really think about it, startups might know technology or they might know customers, but almost do they never know all those things, channel, pricing, competitors, etc. And it used to be just a walk in the woods with a blindfold, with a shotgun to your head, which was burn rate. And that usually didn't end well. And so what we decided is, why don't we use a framework, which is Alexander Osterwalder's Business Model Canvas, wrote a great book called Business Model Generation, which you should all have. And then let's test those hypotheses outside the building. The second part was something called customer development, which is my work. And that's covered in 4 Steps to the Epiphany and the Startup Owner's Manual. And then the third piece is, and let's build the product in increments and iteratively rather than ship it all at once, looking for something called the minimum viable product, using agile engineering. And that was Eric Ries's contribution. And those three components were called the Lean Startup. Now, to answer your question, which is, what's the National Science Foundation and the Innovation Corps have to do with this, is once the idea of the Lean Startup started catching on, entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and educators started nodding, yeah, that's a good idea, but hearing about the Lean Startup was kind of like going to IKEA and looking at the furniture there, and then when you get home, there's just a piece of parts for you to assemble with missing screws. So what we decided was we were actually going to teach a class called the Lean Launchpad, which I taught at Stanford, now teach at Berkeley, Columbia, UCSF, etc., that actually would take those components and turn it into a hands-on experiential class that runs a semester, a quarter. I teach 5-day versions, it's online, and see if we could get teams to actually build real companies inside the classroom and test all their hypotheses, and they have to talk to 100 customers eyeball to eyeball in 10 weeks. When I built this class, I got a phone call from someone in the US government, and I was driving along the Stanford campus who said, "Hi, you don't know me, we're from the US government, we need your help." And because I'm still a smartass, I said, "Well, you got my help during Vietnam, you're not getting it again." And they said, no, we're from the National Science Foundation. And I honestly, at the time, said, "Who's the National Science Foundation?" And they had to explain, it's the second largest government, it is the government funder for all university research in the US, and next to the National Institute of Health, the second largest funder of research in the country. And they said, "We've been writing checks for scientists to take their research and build companies for 30 years through a mandate of Congress in a program called the SBIR and STTR programs. And thank goodness Congress hasn't asked how we're doing, because the results are miserable." And I said, "Why are you calling me?" And they said, "We think you invented the scientific method for entrepreneurship." Make a long story short, the National Science Foundation adopted my class. I helped them teach the first couple of them. Now it's taught in 15 universities. We've just crossed 300 teams of principal investigators and their teams, probably the third largest accelerator in the world now. And probably sometime this year, the National Institute of Health will adopt it as well. Somebody asked the question is, will this work for hardware and life sciences? We just ran a class at UCSF, which is a life sciences class here in the Bay Area for teams in therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, and digital health, and the results were pretty spectacular. Actually, they were unexpectedly spectacular, so much so that we went to the NIH to see if they'll adopt it. What was your question?
Well,
are we out of time now?
No,
Can we go?
When you go from thinking about individual companies and models for individual companies
Yep.
moving from idea to product,
Yep.
how does that different when you're talking about large groups of companies? And how
You
do
mean ecosystems?
Yeah, how do you, and or even just portfolio management at scale?
So it was very, you know, I'm a product now for the last 36 years of Silicon Valley. So, you know, everything to me looks like a scalable startup. And even when I was, that is a startup designed to either get to $1 billion or go out of business. And I thought those were the only types of startups. And when I started teaching, I got one shock to the system, which was I started sitting through other entrepreneurship classes just to see what everybody else was teaching, and realized my definition of startups were very different than others. And I realized we didn't even have a taxonomy of what a startup was. And especially for government officials trying to build ecosystems, I now remind everybody that the first question you want to ask is, you know, what type of startup and what type of entrepreneur are you interested in building in your ecosystem? Are you interested in dealing with lifestyle entrepreneurs? That is, around California, there are people who love to surf, and the way they fund their surfing is to put up a little sign on the surf shack that says surfing lessons 9:30 to 10:45. And then when they're done, they have enough money. They are entrepreneurs, but I don't know how to teach them because their interests are not in the company, it's the lifestyle. There's another type of entrepreneurship in the US that we kind of give short shrift through, but I would bet a good chunk of you actually address in your areas, and those are small business entrepreneurs. You know, 99.7% of all companies in the US are under 500 people. And small business entrepreneurs make up, that's Main Street US. But that's a very different entrepreneurship than what we do in Silicon Valley. But the tools and techniques are the same. But we have to understand that the tactics are different. The availability of capital is different, the scale is different, the teams are different, the resources are different, et cetera. So lifestyle, small business. Then there are what we do in the Valley, scalable startups. Scalable startups are designed to grow big or go home, period. Except in the last 5 years, we have a new variant, which I'll just, for the sake of putting them in a different bucket, which I call buyable startups. Teams building apps or websites, web mobile cloud, happy to get acquired by Facebook, Google, Twitter, et cetera. 3,000 acquisitions in the last 5 years, typically acquired for $2 to $50 million. Nice different category than a Tesla or a SpaceX or something designed to grow the scale. And then there's corporate entrepreneurship, which every large corporation understands they're being disrupted. And therefore, they need to change their DNA of their company. And almost every one of them now in the Fortune 1000 are experimenting with VPs of innovation and corporate innovation centers. And I have a view, and I've been working with Hank Chesborough at Berkeley, who's done open innovation, that we're actually just about to crack the code on this. And that's just another group. So to answer your question, you got to ask the question first is, what kind of ecosystem do we want to build and for who? And when you start mixing them and confusing them, you really get unexpectedly poor results.
You talked about how you're trying to move to a Moneyball model of thinking of companies. And for those of you maybe from other countries, or those of you who aren't into baseball, maybe explaining Moneyball might be useful.
So Moneyball came from both a book and a movie about a baseball team in the United States called the Oakland A's. Anybody read the book or see the movie? For the rest of you, what it was is the Oakland A's was a team that was poor. The management wouldn't spend money to acquire talent, and they always lost to the New York Yankees. Whatever the year was, lose to New York Yankees was kind of in their script, until they got a new manager who realized they couldn't compete on salaries to acquire baseball players, but they were going to get smart about data. They actually discovered that the Yankees and other baseball teams were paying for the wrong players, that there were actually some metrics and data that no one was looking at, that actually there were more interesting statistics than the number of hits or number of home runs. It was actually how many times someone gets on base, how many times did they score, et cetera. And they actually used data analysis for the first time in baseball to actually build a winning team with about a fifth the budget of the New York Yankees. And this phrase Moneyball now kind of applies to how do you use analytics as an unfair advantage. And what we've noticed in building now 3,000 startup teams using this Lean Launchpad method is we collect a whole series of data about the number of customers interviewed, the number of interactions with mentors and instructors, the numbers of hypotheses tested, the number of pivots, the amount of validation of the business model canvas, so much such that we believe we are now capable of predicting across a portfolio who the winners and losers might be. And we think it might be possible to play Moneyball both inside startups and inside corporate incubators as well. Doesn't guarantee success, but I think we could probably tell you about that we have evidence of trajectory and speed of these early stage ventures.
When you're working with these companies like in the Innovation Core program, what do you find the personal transformation of the individuals involved? I mean, a lot of these people are going through a process that is very foreign to them. As they're going out, you're saying they're talking to 100 customers in a very short amount of time. What happens to them in that process?
Well, they get religion, and the religion is. Let me start with a slight digression. It took me for a long time. I've now been teaching. Was an entrepreneur for 21 years, and then been teaching for about 12. And it took me a long time to answer the question. My entrepreneurial friends who knew me as a rapacious entrepreneur, they'd laugh when they heard I was teaching entrepreneurship. They'd say, "Steve, you can't teach entrepreneurship. You were born entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are just born." And I realized, how do we teach entrepreneurship? Is it just we stand in a lecture, or what is it like? And it took me about a decade to realize that we actually had the wrong model for who we were teaching. And we weren't, I think, astute enough to realize that entrepreneurship, which was historically started being taught in business schools, was being taught like it was just accounting. Well, if no one's ever noticed, accountants don't run startups. It's a big idea. And for those of you who are accountants, my apologies, but very few accountants run, none. So the question is, who are entrepreneurs and what are they closest to? Are they managers or engineers or scientists? Turns out none of the above. Turns out the minute someone commits to an entrepreneurial journey, they're an artist. It's a big idea. They're closer to artists than anyone else we know. And just like artists, the ones that make it are ones who have vision, passion, tenacity, deal with failure, recover, keep going. And in fact, we were teaching them like accountants when we actually should have been looking at art school, which was the other mistake, is that entrepreneurship used to be taught by I'll stand in front of the room, show you a lot of slides, bring in some guest lecturers so they could be smart in front of you and you'll take notes. And that's not how we teach art. I mean, in fact, that's not even how we teach brain surgery. How about you like to go in for brain surgery and someone says, yeah, I read about it on page 425. Okay. And I had some great PowerPoint in that room. What you really think about is art, medicine, etc., is, yes, we teach theory, but we spend an inordinate amount of time on practice, practice, practice. It's an experiential education. And all these things I teach and all these incubators and accelerators are about hands-on and about experience. Of course, we give them lean startup theory, but that's just to prepare them for the shock to the system. Now, to answer your question, we teach these scientists theory, but they get the theory in a second. Hypothesis testing for scientists, at least for the National Science Foundation, they've been doing that their entire career. Except now, all of a sudden, we're going to say, oh, those hypotheses you've been testing in the lab, we're going to make you get out and talk to people you don't know. Now, these are I'm saying this to people where the distinction between an introvert and an extrovert is whether they're looking at their shoes or your shoes. And think about that. And now I'm teaching them they have to make eye contact with 100 people in 10 weeks. And we train them to do that, like in my entrepreneurial career, I always hired engineers and trained them to be marketeers, which was a lot easier trying to teach marketeers than be engineers. And smart engineers, even though they actually almost always never had any natural empathy, I taught them how to run emulation mode, which is a way to kind of fake it, Okay, practice asking, how's the kids? How about them name of local team? Niners, And so you could teach people how to actually go into emulation mode versus teaching, marketeers how to be domain experts. And what's surprising is because it's National Science Foundation, they instrumented this class, top to bottom. We know what they knew coming in, we know what they knew going out, we know what they thought, we know what happened. And the results were pretty unexpectedly good. We had 30 years of data that said what happened to teams who didn't take this class, and they ended up trying to get funded, and 18% of them passed peer review funding. Okay, so what happened to teams who did take this class? I got a call from the National Science Foundation that says we need to change our SBIR program. Well, why? Well, we just got data back from 2.5 years of your class. Well, good news or bad news? Well, we had to look at the numbers a couple times. Well, what's the result? Well, 18% who didn't take your class get funded, 60% who take your class get funded, double-blind, peer-reviewed, etc. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting outcome. The other unintended consequence is these scientists go back to their universities and now ask their universities to start teaching this class, not for the NSF, but for their own students. And so we put together with the National Science Foundation and a nonprofit called NCIIA.org a class for educators, teaching educators, and we teach 75 of them a quarter. And I saw a couple from University of Oklahoma. Where are the Oklahoma guys? Raise your hand, right over there, who took the class, and they're still talking to me, and I think and you might want to talk to them about, we teach people in 2.5 days how to teach this class back in their own universities.
And you talk about entrepreneurship as an art form.
Yep.
Does everybody have that inner artist in them, or are some folks just not cut out to be artists?
So it's really interesting. So what I teach is, think of it as the advanced art class, right? Whether it's sculpture or painting or something else. But as a society, we've kind of thought that it's pretty cool to teach art appreciation to people who don't know yet whether they're artists, but in fact have never even heard that you could be a musician or a painter or a sculptor. So one of the things we do in lower grades is teach art appreciation, and people go, and kids go, oh, you mean that's a career? I love that. Yeah, I like to try. Oh, look at that, I'm good at this. Imagine we did the same thing with entrepreneurship appreciation. If we treated it like an art rather than a class, we actually could figure out who has that inside of them, and we could kind of get those kids early on. And by the way, nowadays, they're showing up even before we're teaching those classes. So the answer is, you don't know who has it in them, but to say everybody does is, I think it's an intellectual conceit, like saying everybody could be a great painter, or a great artist, or a great musician. Different people have sometimes latent or innate talents that we could bring out if we let them self-identify, or if we give them some early education. I think the same is true for entrepreneurship, but it's not for everybody. Entrepreneurship is just like being an artist. You fail most of the time, and you have to be driven by something other than money, or, I can't think of any artist who goes into art because they want to be rich. I think they go into art because they want to express themselves. People become entrepreneurs because they want to change the world. And Silicon Valley and our current ecosystem allows us to change the world and make a ton of money at the same time. What could be better than that? But when I did 8 startups, I never once said, gee, and let's structure this to make $1 billion. I always did it because it was the most exciting thing I could think to do with my life, and I couldn't believe I was getting paid to do it.
When companies moving past that process where you take them through the Innovation Core program or the Lean Launchpad program and they're off, where do they hit the stumbling block first? Like, what is the most common source of failure? Someone had asked this right after they get out of the program.
That's a great question, because one of the things we teach is that there's 4 types of startups, and you never get a memo which one you're in. And let me just briefly explain. So I used to be confused that, these activities I did in one startup, then I do another startup, and none of them worked. And gee, all this stuff worked over here. How come it didn't work over here? Turns out 4 types of startups. One is a startup in an existing market. How do you know you're in an existing market? You got customers, there are competitors, your customers can tell you the basis of competition. You could go outside the building and ask them exactly what features they'd want. Boom, existing market, you launch, your job is to show up with a higher performance product and take market share. There's another type of existing market where in fact the incumbents are so strong, Microsoft, Google, etc., you going head on is kind of a suicide track. But you can decide that maybe, gee, I can make the product in China 80% of the features at 20% of the price and be a low-cost provider, or even more so, I could understand the needs of a certain niche of users and then actually do a resegmentation of an existing market. And you could still go out and talk to end users. There's a third type of startup. It's the type that Steve Jobs said, we don't do market research. And that's a new market. New market, what do we know about the market? Nothing. No customers, no users, good news, no competitors, but like you're a visionary, you think. Most of the time you're actually hallucinating, but that's okay. But you don't sit in your room. The model Apple PR, I think, did the worst disservice to entrepreneurship. They kind of created this vision of Steve Jobs sitting in some Zen Lotus position in a lead-lined room with lightning bolts coming out of his head. It didn't work that way. Jobs actually was a great, probably the best kind of intersection of art and science kind of eyeballs that were there. He understood culture, he understood technology enough to make him understand what would be next. But you still go out of the building trying to understand what the day in the life of the customer is today versus what it's going to be like in the next couple of years. And then finally, the 4th type of market is a clone. If you're overseas, that is outside the US, you could take a US business model in a country that has north of 100 million people, regulatory barriers or cultural barriers and or language barriers, take a US business model, adapt and adopt it for your culture, and boom, you might have a profitable business. So the first step is testing all this, and sometimes the runway is a lot longer than you thought. You might think you're in an existing business. Nope, you're in a new market. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, and so it seems like you're saying that the biggest source of failure varies depending on your market.
Sure.
Right?
It not only varies, it's the biggest source of failure when I was an entrepreneur is, in fact, anybody remember the internet bubble? For some of you, your grandparents can explain it to you, but we ran $1 trillion science experiment in the US and Europe, which essentially We were in a new market, and we spent like we were in an existing market.
The parties were great, though.
The parties were great, and the people who got rich were your advertising and PR agencies. It's a big idea. What we were trying to do is force adoption of technology before it can actually diffuse at a natural rate. And you know, the classic was pets.com, right? And you know, people were talking about shipping pet food over the internet before someone in Nebraska understood what the internet was. It kind of like didn't work. And it wasn't that these products were stupid, it's that they were all new markets, meaning we should have husbanded our cash and waited for the adoption curve. Instead, we spent just like we were in an existing market and blew all of it on sales and marketing dollars, when in hindsight, infinite dollars wouldn't have moved the adoption curve earlier. Does that make sense? And that's why I talk about market type, is because a lot of startups just spend their cash at the wrong time.
So it sounds like you would say that one of the questions was, how portable is the culture of innovation? Can you actually construct it? And it sounds like you are constructing it. You're constructing it with sort of a hands-on, practical element where you're forcing people into interactions that might make them comfortable, but you give them places to bounce back and survive.
So I'm constructing it on multiple levels. One is on this tactical level of lean startup principles, the lean launchpad classes. But the biggest surprise for me in the last 5 years is getting out of Silicon Valley. And you know, I've been invited to talk at ecosystems in Chile and Finland and Russia and China and Japan. I'm probably missing 5 or 6 other countries, and finding out that innovation is everywhere. In fact, when my wife and I were in Prague, you know, she said, "Oh, I'm tired of tourist dinners. Maybe there's some entrepreneurs in Prague. Steve, why don't you tweet and see if there's anybody in town who might show." So I tweeted, I'm in town, and like an hour and a half later, we're having dinner in a beer hall with 60 entrepreneurs, and I'm on Prague TV. And it just, you know, that was the moment when I went, gee, you know, Silicon Valley is now everywhere. The distinction and the reason why I believe most people here in this audience is, what's missing in that ecosystem to actually make it work at scale? And I have a couple of ideas. I read a blog called steveblank.com. I don't know if any of you've seen it, but if you're interested, I just did an analysis of the Bend, Oregon ecosystem. And if you want to see my thoughts on what that would look like, it's just Google Steve Blank, Bigger in Bend. And it's a 3-part series, but the last part has a diagram of my view of what an entrepreneurial ecosystem requires. And I should tell you, having Anna Lee here is, she was my role model, because I thought Silicon Valley was it when I came out, but didn't realize that in the late 70s, when I first came out to Silicon Valley, it wasn't clear whether it was Silicon Valley or Boston in the United States that was going to win. And in Anna Lee's book, Regional Advantage, you should all read, it was such an eye-opener. And one of the things, you know, she gives multiple reasons which all are true. One of them for me was, you know, the VCs in Silicon Valley were different than the VCs in Boston. By the late 70s, early 80s, VCs in Boston were acting like bankers. VCs in Silicon Valley were acting like pirates. And I truly believe we can make a list of a lot of stuff, but and the cultural things she goes through are clearly essential. But if you don't have a risk capital with an underlying risk capital ecosystem, you're dead on arrival. You can have all the entrepreneurs and all the universities. My favorite is the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, best school I was ever thrown out of. And I go back there often because they're an I-Core node. And a world-class, they graduate 6,000 engineers a year, and my joke is when they get their diploma, they ask them if they want a ticket for the East Coast or the West Coast. You would think they'd be able to build an ecosystem, but there isn't a risk capital culture there at scale that actually understands what's required to build the ecosystem.
And when you say pirates, the VCs were pirates, what makes a pirate?
So, you know, one of the things we tend to promote or write about because it's sexy and it makes good copy is the entrepreneurial stories. And stories of entrepreneurs and plucky entrepreneurs and crazy entrepreneurs. I mean, it's all true. But it's a matched ecosystem. You know, an entrepreneurial culture without a risk capital culture is like one hand clapping. You know, it doesn't make much noise. And so Silicon Valley has investment climate unlike anywhere else. VCs and now angels will throw money at things where everywhere else in the world you kind of laugh. You want to see their pedigree and where they came from, and it doesn't matter.
Why do they do it? I mean, if you really spreadsheeted a lot of this stuff out, you really shouldn't do it.
Right, you shouldn't do it at all. And I think at least the wave of VCs that scaled in the 70s and the 80s, the Kleiner Perkins and the Mayfields and eventually the Sequoias and on the East Coast, the Greylocks, were as visionary as the entrepreneurs. They understood that there was something more than just being another asset class. And think about for the financial risk here. What other financial asset class do you tell your investors that you're going to lose 90% of the deals you're investing in are going to go bad, and you're going to make it up on the 10%? Maybe the housing market, but besides that, so that didn't happen anywhere else. That's not fair. It's now happened, obviously, in Israel. It happened in Singapore. It happened in Beijing. And so there are a couple of clusters now that, and by the way, going to Beijing and Herzliya in Israel, always an eye-opener for anybody who wants to understand what's going on in other places of the world.
One of the questions, and people ask this too, which is how do you connect to the ecosystem? Say you're starting a company or an idea in a place far-flung. How do you actually connect back into the systems, the highway system that exists somewhere else?
Yeah, move there.
What do you do if you can't? What if you're stuck somewhere?
Take up banking. I'm serious. It's like trying to say I want to run a steel mill in a place where there's no ecosystem. You could either try to you either want to build the ecosystem, that's a different job, or if you're an entrepreneur, it's like, gee, I want to make a movie and I live in Kansas. Yes, you could go try to do that, but there are economies of scale trying to do them in clusters. And now, in the U.S., the only cluster is not Silicon Valley. New York is a cluster for a series of things, and if you're in biotech or life sciences, San Diego and Boston are clusters. But if you're asking me the question, is that if I'm an individual entrepreneur, I could certainly start elsewhere, but there are resources of scale here that are kind of interesting. And I'm not saying this is the only place to be, but you really have to make a checklist of, do I need money? Well, great. Where's the money? That's why Willie Sutton robbed banks, right? When they asked him, he said, well, that's where they put the money. If I'm an entrepreneur, why would I go to Silicon Valley? Well, until your local area builds an ecosystem, that's where the money is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs that are dealing with this issue because they want to stay home, right, because they've got a bunch of reasons to be at home. Right. But then they also realize that they don't have the ecosystem. Right. And so they're trying to struggle to build the ecosystem while they're building these companies.
Right. So that's a different question of, do I think that's correct and do I believe that's the way it should be? No, I don't. I help other regions start thinking about what does it take and what are the components to build an ecosystem and can you engineer it? For most of you, I hope you know Silicon Valley was a complete accident. When I read Annalee's book, the only thing that I thought was missing was the effect that the military had on Silicon Valley. And so anybody ever see The Secret History of Silicon Valley? It's the best YouTube talk you will ever see in your life. It's brilliant. It's mine. But basically that the Valley was funded by military and intelligence agencies during the Cold War, and it wasn't unique. Obviously, MIT got the same amount of funding, Johns Hopkins, etc. But there was a single professor at Stanford that actually turned Stanford for the first time into an outward-facing university. And for not just entrepreneurial reasons, but because he thought these startups, he believed it was going to be Microwave Valley, not Silicon Valley, were going to help win the Cold War. Worthwhile video in conjunction with Annalee's book for those of you who want to understand the Valley.
Mm-hmm. Two more questions people asked. One, gender empowerment. How do you design gender empowerment into, say, designing like the I-Corps, which is a lot of scientists which are often male, right, in these programs?
That's a spectacularly important question that I'm going to punt on.
Okay. It's a tough question.
Well, the question's easy. The answer's hard.
The good thing is we're going to tackle that a lot during the rest of this conference, too. A question someone asked on schooling. How do we change schooling? Knowing that there's a process to building startup companies. You talked about teaching entrepreneurship like an art form to young kids and exposing them. What else can we do with schooling to get this inculcated early?
Let me give you an example. So there's two schools I know who've been teaching the lean startup in middle schools and high school, Hawkins School in Cleveland and Dunn School here in California, and they're actually going to put on a conference in June on how to teach early stage education, experiential entrepreneurship. And I think it might be a model of what we're going to do across the U.S. I think we're just learning how to do this, but I think the metaphor that I offered earlier is entrepreneurship as an art rather than a science or a business class is probably a closer metaphor to what we do. And in closing, let me just tell you the other piece that gets missed sometimes in ecosystems. And I only noticed this in my travels. We take for granted here in Silicon Valley of something called the pay it forward culture. And the pay it forward culture simply says, if you've been successful, you have a social and moral obligation to help people you don't know who are younger than you. Period. End of discussion. And the Valley has a long history of this, going all the way back to the first Silicon guys who used to have lunch with each other and help each other even though they were competitors. And then the Homebrew Computer Club, which was where Jobs and Wozniak shared the schematics of the Apple I. And then ethnic organizations, starting with TIE, the Indian Entrepreneurial Network, and others that helped immigrant entrepreneurs. And so there's this notion that not only do you help others, but you don't ask for anything. And let me tell you, when I went to Russia, I had to get that translated at least 5 or 6 times. No, we don't ask for anything. And it was like, I don't think that ever went across in a translation. And in Chile, it was understood, but it was like, why would we do that? And I think that's one of the many cultural pieces here. I must have 5 or 6 meetings a week with young entrepreneurs who have either been my students or kind of interesting. I'm not particularly interested in investing, but they sound like they have some interesting questions and that are framed well. I'll go meet with them and spend some time doing that. And I'm not the only one who does that. There are thousands of people in this valley who just give back because of what we've gotten here. So when I travel outside this valley, that's one of the key things I emphasize. And I think it goes back to your rainforest analogy, is that it only takes about 5 or 6 people in a local ecosystem to raise their hand who are leaders and thought leaders, say, we're going to do this, and you do it visibly in a coffee shop, not in some fancy restaurant, but in a coffee shop where the entrepreneurs are, and they see you doing that, and the buzz starts. And the buzz starts in the entrepreneurs, and the buzz starts in other thought leaders feeling a little embarrassed that they're not doing it. So it doesn't take much to jumpstart that in your ecosystem.
I often, the analogy I use for the pay-it-forward culture is that it takes favors from being a barter economy into a currency economy. Right. Instead of just exchange, you're actually creating a free-flowing set of favors. In a system.
That was one of the best things that ever happened to me in Silicon Valley when I was young. You could get to, and you can still almost get to anybody in Silicon Valley with a, short and precise email that says, I need some help, here's what I could share with you, and blah, blah, I need 10 minutes of your time. Great.
Thank you for sharing more than 10 minutes of your time, Steve.
Thank you.